The day a luxury golf resort tried to sue me because of my goats was the same day I realized some wealthy people genuinely believe fences only matter when they protect their property. By the time the whole mess was over, a judge had ordered them to tear apart part of their precious golf course. My legal fees were paid, and 30 goats had accidentally become the most expensive landscaping crew in county history. Now if that sounds crazy, trust me, I lived it, and there were moments when I thought I was losing my mind. My name is Caleb Turner, and my family has raised goats on the same rocky hillside outside Cedar Ridge for almost 100 years. My great-grandfather bought the land when nobody wanted it because it was steep, covered in scrub brush, and too rough for farming. Turns out goats absolutely loved it. By the time the property came down to me, I had 35 acres of hills, oak trees, and stubborn animals that seemed to wake up every morning looking for new ways to test my patience. It wasn't glamorous, but it was home. Most mornings started the same way. Coffee before sunrise, checking fences, feeding animals, and listening to the quiet. For most of my life, the loudest thing around here was a coyote in the distance or one of my goats screaming because another goat looked at him wrong. Then everything changed when developers bought the valley below my property. At first, people in town were excited. They talked about jobs, tourism, rising property values. The developers promised a world-class golf destination called Silver Crest Country Club. The brochures looked like something out of a luxury vacation magazine. Perfect fairways, sparkling ponds, wealthy retirees smiling while wearing clothes that probably cost more than my truck payment. Construction lasted almost 2 years. Bulldozers reshaped the valley. Crews planted grass, so green it almost looked fake. They built stone bridges, decorative waterfalls, and a clubhouse that looked bigger than our local high school. When the place finally opened, membership fees were so expensive that most locals only saw the course through pictures online. Still, I had no problem with any of it. Their land was their land. Mine was mine. We had a fence separating us, and that was good enough for me. The first year passed peacefully. My goats grazed the hillside. Golfers played below. Sometimes I'd see little carts moving across the fairways while I repaired fences or hauled feed. Two completely different worlds existing side by side. Then came the improvements. That's what they called them anyway. One afternoon, I was checking water lines when I noticed something strange. A fence post near the south boundary looked different. At first, I figured I was imagining things. You stare at enough fence posts over the years, and eventually, they all start looking the same. But something bothered me. A week later, I noticed another section that looked off. Then another. It wasn't dramatic. 10 feet here. 12 feet there. Small changes that most people would never notice. The problem was I'd walked that fence line thousands of times in my life. I knew every bend, every tree, every rock. My grandfather used to joke that I knew the property better than the goats did. One Saturday morning, I grabbed old survey maps from my office and started measuring. The more I measured, the angrier I got. The fence wasn't where it belonged. Somebody had moved sections of it inward. Not outward toward the golf course. Inward toward my property. Piece by piece. Section by section. By sunset, I was staring at numbers I didn't want to believe. Nearly an acre of pasture had disappeared. An entire acre. It wasn't some misunderstanding. It wasn't a surveying error. Somebody had physically relocated sections of my fence and absorbed my land into the golf course. I drove down to Silver Crest the next morning. The clubhouse looked exactly like what you'd expect from a place that charged rich people ridiculous amounts of money to chase a ball around grass. Marble floors. Expensive furniture. Employees smiling like they were trained by a corporate happiness consultant. Eventually, I met the general manager. His name was Bryce Calloway. Mid-40s. Perfect haircut. Expensive watch. The kind of guy who could turn an apology into a sales pitch. I explained what I'd found. He listened with a polite smile that never quite reached his eyes. Then he leaned back and said, "Caleb, are you sure you're looking at updated survey information?" I remember staring at him for a second because that answer irritated me immediately. Not because he disagreed, but because he already sounded like he knew exactly what had happened. "I'm sure," I said. "Your people moved my fence." His smile tightened. "I seriously doubt that." That's when I realized this wasn't going to be a simple conversation. I left that meeting trying to convince myself Bryce was just misinformed, that maybe some contractor had made a mistake and management didn't know about it yet. But deep down I already knew better. I've spent my entire life reading people. When you raise livestock, You learn pretty quickly that trouble usually announces itself before it arrives. Sometimes it's a storm cloud forming on the horizon. Sometimes it's a nervous animal acting strange. And sometimes it's a man in a tailored golf shirt, smiling while he lies directly to your face. Over the next week, I hired a licensed surveyor to remove every possible doubt. I wanted paperwork so airtight, even the most expensive attorney couldn't wiggle around it. The survey took several days. When the final report arrived, every measurement matched my suspicions. The original property markers were exactly where they'd always been. The fence had been relocated multiple times during the golf course expansion projects. In some places they had taken 10 feet. In others 15. One section had nearly 20 feet missing. Altogether it added up to almost an acre of my pasture. An acre might not sound like much to some people, but on a working goat farm, every acre matters. More importantly, it wasn't just land. It was my family's land. My grandfather had repaired those fences. My father had repaired those fences. Now some corporation had decided they could simply redraw reality because they had deeper pockets. Armed with the survey, I drove back to Silver Crest. This time Bryce's confidence lasted about 30 seconds. He studied the documents, flipped through the pages, and for the first time I saw a genuine concern flash across his face. It disappeared quickly. Corporate people are good at that. Well, he said carefully, there may be some minor discrepancies. Minor discrepancies? I almost laughed. You stole an acre of my property. Let's not use words like stole. What word would you prefer? He folded his hands. The course has undergone significant capital improvements. There may have been boundary interpretation issues during construction. I still remember that sentence because it was one of the dumbest things I'd ever heard. Boundary interpretation issues. As if property lines were poetry and everyone was free to discover their own meaning. Then he made the mistake that changed everything. He said, perhaps we can discuss compensation. I stared at him. Compensation? A lease arrangement perhaps. Financial consideration. A mutually beneficial agreement. What he was really saying was simple. They had already built expensive improvements on my land, and now they wanted to pay me for the privilege of keeping what they took. The arrogance of it nearly took my breath away. No, I said. Move everything back. His smile vanished completely. That would be extremely expensive. Should have thought about that before you moved the fence. We sat there in silence for a few seconds. Then I stood up. 30 days. Put it back where it belongs. Bryce didn't answer. He didn't have to. The look on his face told me exactly what they planned to do. Nothing. 30 days came and went. Not only did they ignore my demand, they doubled down. New sprinkler lines appeared on my property. Decorative shrubs got planted. A cart path extension started creeping across land that legally belonged to me. Every improvement felt like a deliberate message. Sue us if you want. We have more money than you. Around that time my friend Wade stopped by the farm. Wade had been my neighbor for years and possessed the rare ability to make bad situations funny. He listened while I explained everything. Then he looked toward the golf course and said, you know what's funny? What? Your goats probably think that's the greatest buffet in America. I laughed despite myself because he wasn't wrong. Silver Crest maintained grass that looked like it belonged in a commercial. Thick, green, constantly watered. To a goat, it was paradise. The problem was my goats couldn't actually reach it because of the fence. Or at least they shouldn't have been able to. A few days later I discovered several weak spots along the boundary where construction crews had damaged fencing while moving equipment. I documented everything with photos. Broken wire. Loose posts. Gaps. I sent copies to Silver Crest and requested repairs. They ignored those too. Looking back, that's the moment they really doomed themselves. Because goats are many things. Stubborn. Clever. Annoying. Opportunistic. And when 30 goats discover a weakness between them and unlimited gourmet grass, they become surprisingly motivated engineers. The first escape happened during a busy Saturday tournament. I was fixing a water trough when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Silver Crest. I answered and immediately heard someone shouting. Apparently 12 goats had wandered onto the 7th fairway. Wandered wasn't even the right word. From what witnesses later told me, they marched in like they owned the place. By the time groundskeepers arrived, the goats had eaten a long strip of premium grass and decorated the putting green with enough droppings to create an entirely new hazard category. Bryce called me personally a few minutes later. Do you have any idea what's happened? He demanded. I assume you're referring to the fence repairs you never made? Silence. Then more shouting. He threatened invoices, lawsuits, damages. I reminded him that I'd repeatedly documented the damaged fence. I reminded him that his crews had created the openings. Most importantly, I reminded him that several of those openings sat inside disputed property areas that legally belonged to me. He hung up furious. I thought maybe that incident would finally force them to address the problem. Instead, they became even more arrogant. They repaired a few visible sections, but ignored many others. They also accelerated construction on disputed land, as if they were racing against a clock. Then came the charity tournament. If the first goat invasion annoyed them, the second one became local legend. Silvercrest hosted a major fundraising event every year. Business owners, local politicians, television personalities, wealthy donors, everybody who enjoyed being photographed while pretending to care about charity showed up. The course looked immaculate that morning. Tents, banners, catering stations, luxury cars filling the parking lot. Around 9 o'clock, one of the unrepaired fence sections finally failed. Then another. 30 goats suddenly found themselves facing the most beautiful salad bar they'd ever seen. What happened next was chaos on a level I couldn't have planned if I'd spent months trying. The herd scattered across multiple holes. Some attacked ornamental flowers. Several chewed tournament flags. One particularly ambitious goat discovered sprinkler heads and began treating them like chew toys. Others rolled around in sand bunkers for reasons only goats understand. Players abandoned golf carts. Volunteers chased animals. Spectators pulled out phones and started recording videos. By noon, the entire event had become a circus. The tournament was canceled. News crews arrived. Social media exploded. One local station actually aired drone footage showing goats running across the course while volunteers chased them. Wade called me laughing so hard he could barely breathe. "Your goats made television," he said. Unfortunately, Bryce wasn't laughing. 3 days later, I was served with a lawsuit seeking $50,000 in damages. Reading the complaint actually made me smile, because buried underneath all their accusations was a fatal problem. To win, they'd have to explain how the goats entered the property, and explaining that would force them to explain the fencing, and explaining the fencing would force them to explain the stolen land. The moment I finished reading their lawsuit, I called my attorney and said, "Let's do this." A week later, we filed our counterclaim. And once the legal machinery started moving, Silvercrest was finally about to learn that money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy ownership of somebody else's property. Once the lawsuits were filed, everything changed. Up until then, Bryce and the people at Silvercrest had been operating under the assumption that I would eventually get tired, run out of money, or simply accept some settlement that allowed them to keep what they'd taken. What they didn't understand was that farmers are stubborn in ways money people rarely appreciate. We spend our lives fighting droughts, storms, broken equipment, predators, and markets that seem determined to ruin us. Persistence becomes part of your personality. The legal process dragged on for months. Survey records were reviewed. Construction documents were subpoenaed. Emails surfaced. Contractors gave depositions. And little by little, the story that Silvercrest had been trying to hide started falling apart. What hurt them most wasn't my testimony. It wasn't even the survey. It was their own paperwork. Internal communications showed repeated discussions about maximizing usable course acreage. Construction maps showed boundary concerns raised by contractors. Several employees admitted that questions about property lines had been brought to management during development. Suddenly, their claim that everything was an innocent misunderstanding became much harder to sell. The courtroom itself was almost anticlimactic. By the time the trial arrived, the facts were sitting in neat stacks of documents. The judge spent hours reviewing surveys, photographs, construction records, and testimony. Bryce sat at the defense table looking far less confident than the man I'd first met in that fancy clubhouse. The expensive smile was gone. The polished corporate language wasn't helping anymore. Facts have a way of stripping away performance. At one point, the judge held up one of the surveys and asked a simple question. "Are you disputing the location of the original property boundary?" Their attorney hesitated. That pause lasted maybe 2 seconds. It felt like 2 hours. Because everyone in the room knew the answer. They couldn't dispute it. The evidence was overwhelming. From that moment on, the outcome felt inevitable. A few weeks later, the ruling arrived. I was standing in my barn when my attorney called. I still remember leaning against a feed bin while listening. The court ordered full restoration of the original property boundary. Every encroaching improvement had to be removed from my land. The cart path extension had to go. Landscaping had to go. Irrigation systems had to be relocated. The fencing had to be restored to its original location. Silver Crest was ordered to cover my legal fees. Then came my favorite part. The judge specifically ruled that I was not liable for damages resulting from livestock escapes caused by fencing conditions that Silver Crest had created or failed to repair. I actually laughed out loud standing there in the barn. One of my goats looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had, just a little. Over the following months, I got a front row seat to one of the most expensive lessons in arrogance I've ever witnessed. Construction crews returned, but this time they weren't building. They were tearing things apart. Sections of landscaping disappeared. Sprinkler systems were dug up and moved. Portions of the cart path were removed. Entire areas of turf had to be reconstructed. Every excavator bucket, every repair crew, every truckload of replacement material represented money they never would have spent if they had simply respected a fence line in the first place. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in town. People who had once assumed the wealthy golf resort could do whatever it wanted suddenly saw something different. They saw consequences. Even Wade enjoyed the show. One afternoon we stood near the boundary watching workers relocate fencing. He shook his head and said, "You know, those goats probably cost them more money than any lawyer did." He was probably right. Eventually the new fence was completed exactly where it belonged. For the first time in a long while, the boundary felt settled. My pasture was whole again. The goats had their space. The golf course had theirs. Funny enough, the goats never understood any of the drama. They didn't know about lawsuits, property disputes, surveys, or court rulings. They just knew there had once been access to incredible grass, and now there wasn't. Life moved on. The seasons changed. New kids got hired at the farm. New golfers showed up at Silver Crest. Bryce eventually left the resort, though I never learned whether he resigned or was encouraged to find opportunities elsewhere. Around town, people still occasionally bring up the story. Somebody will recognize me at a feed store or gas station and ask, "Are you the goat guy?" Then they'll laugh before I can answer. The truth is, this story was never really about goats. It was about boundaries. Not just property boundaries, but the idea that some people become so convinced of their own importance that they stop respecting everyone else's rights. Silver Crest thought money would protect them from accountability. They thought expensive improvements would somehow erase ownership. They thought a small farmer would back down. Instead, the very shortcuts they took ended up creating the disaster they were trying to avoid. Looking back, I don't feel angry anymore. Mostly I feel grateful. Grateful that my family kept good records. Grateful that the law still mattered. Grateful that common sense eventually won. And maybe just a little grateful for a herd of stubborn goats with excellent taste in grass. Now here's the part I'm curious about. If you were in my position, would you have accepted their offer to pay for the land after they had already taken it? Or would you have fought to get every inch back no matter how long it took? Let me know down in the comments because people are surprisingly divided whenever this story comes up. And if you enjoyed this one, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your own stories about property disputes, difficult neighbors, or moments when standing your ground turned out to be worth the fight. Sometimes justice arrives through lawyers and court orders, and sometimes it arrives with 4 legs, horns, and a very healthy appetite.